Hello and good day guys, my name is Rene M. Nieves and I am the presenter of this topic, Classical Conditioning by Ivan Pablo. But first, let us know who is Ivan Pablo. Ivan Petrovich Pavlov was a Russian physiologist known primarily for his work in classical conditioning. From his childhood days, Pavlov demonstrated intellectual curiosity along with an unusual energy which he referred to as the instinct for research. He was born in September 26, 1849 in Ryazan, Russia, and he died 27 of February 1936 in St. Petersburg, Russia. And now, let us discuss what is classical conditioning. Classical conditioning, also known as Pavlovian or respondent conditioning, is learning through association and was discovered by Pavlov, a Russian physiologist. Pavlov showed that when a bell sounded each time the dog was fed, the dog learned to associate the sound with the presentation of food. Meaning, ang classical conditioning daw ay kilala rin bilang Pavlovian or respondent conditioning ay natuto sa pamamagitan ng pagsasamahan at atuklasan ni Pavlov. Ipinakita at ipinaliwanag din ni Pavlov na kapag tumunog ang isang kampana na habang pinapakain ng aso ay natututunan ng aso na iugnay ang tunog sa pagtatanghal ng pagkain. So, the most famous example of classical conditioning was Pavlov's experiments with dog, who salivated in response to a bell tone. Pavlov showed that when a bell was sounded each time the dog was fed, the dog learned to associate the sound with the presentation of the food. Isa daw sa mga pinakasikat na halimbawa ng classical conditioning ay ang eksperimento ni Pavlov sa mga aso na nagdalaway bilang tugon sa tono ng kampana. Ipinakita ni Pavlov na kapag tumunog ang isang kampana sa tuwing pinapakain ng aso, natututunan ng aso na iuugnay ang tunog sa pagtatanghal ng pagkain. Terms to know. Number 1. Stimulus. Something that exists in surroundings or that is presented. Second, response. How the animal responds to the stimulus. Now, to understand Pavlov's theory, you need to know. First, unconditioned stimulus. In Pavlov's experiment, the food was the unconditioned stimulus. An unconditioned response is an automatic response to a stimulus. The dog salivating for food is the unconditioned response in Pavlov's experiments. Meaning, sa eksperimento daw ni Pavlov, ang pagkain ay ang unconditioned stimulus, ang walang kondisyong tugon ay isang automatikong tugon sa isang pampasigla. Ang mga asong nagdalaway para sa pagkain ay ang walang kondisyong tugon sa eksperimento ni Pavlov. So next, unconditioned response. In Pavlov's experiment, the food was the unconditioned stimulus. An unconditioned response is an automatic response to a stimulus. The dog salivating for food is the unconditioned response in Pavlov's experiment. A conditioned stimulus is stimulus that can eventually trigger a conditioned response. Sa eksperimento daw ni Pavlov, ang pagkain ay ang unconditioned stimulus. Ang walang kondisyong tugon na isang automatikong tugon sa isang pampasigla. Ang mga asong naglalaway para sa pagkain ay ang walang kondisyong tugon sa eksperimento ni Pavlov. So next, neutral stimulus. Pavlov introduced the ringing of the bell as a neutral stimulus. In Pavlov's experiment, the food was the unconditioned stimulus. An unconditioned response is an automatic response to a stimulus. The dog salivating for food is the unconditioned response in Pavlov's experiments. Ang neutral stimulus daw, ipinakilala ni Pavlov ang tugtog ng kampana bilang neutral na stimulus. Sa eksperimento ni Pavlov, ang pagkain ay ang unconditioned stimulus. Ang walang kondisyong tugon ay isang automatikong tugon sa isang pampasigla. Ang mga asong naglalaway para sa pagkain ay walang kondisyong tugon sa eksperimento ni Pavlov. So, the last one is the conditioned stimulus. The dog salivating for food is the unconditioned response in Pavlov's experiment. In the described experiment, the conditioned stimulus was the ringing of the bell, and the conditioned response was salivation. Let us move on to extinction. In classical conditioning, extinction occurs when the conditioned stimulus is applied repeatedly without being paired with the unconditioned stimulus. Over time, The learned behavior occurs less often and eventually stops altogether, and conditioned stimulus return to neural. Sa classical conditioning, ang extinction ay nangyayari kapag ang conditioned stimulus ay inilipat ng paulit-ulit ng hindi ipinares sa unconditioned stimulus. Sa paglipas ng panahon, ang natutunang pag-uugali ay hindi gaano nangyayari at sa kalaunan ay ganap na huminto. At ang nakakondisyon na stimulus ay babalik sa neural. And now, let us move on to spontaneous recovery. Spontaneous recovery is a phenomenon of learning and memory that was first named and described by Ivan Pavlov in his studies of classical conditioning. In that context, it refers to the re-emergence of a previously extinguished conditioned response after a delay. Ang kusang pagbawi ay isang kababalaghan ng pag-aaral at memorya na unang pinangalanan at inilarawan ni Ivan Pavlov sa kanyang pag-aaral ng classical conditioning. Sa kontekstong iyon, ito ay tumutukoy sa muling paglitaw ng isang dating napatay at nakakondisyon na tugon pagtapos ng pagkakaantala. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.